Shebahonaning, Shebahonaning. This sketch, called Shebahonaning, was published in 1855 by Lawrence Oliphant, former Civil Secretary and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in Canada. We are looking toward the west end of the channel. George Island is on the left side of the sketch. On the right, on the mainland, is de la Morandiere's trading post and part of the village of Shebahonaning. Ani and good day. My name is Adele Loosemore, and I'm a Robinson Huron Treaty Indian from Shebahonaning. My community is located at the entrance to the North Channel of Georgian Bay. I put a white dot on the map below me to show where we are located. This week, we're going to take a look at MNO's big story about racial conflict, the Killarney Metis versus the white settlers. Let's see if MNO's story stands up against the historic record. Our First Nations ancestors are Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. But the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Province of Ontario decided to change their ethnic identity to Métis. They did this by distorting some parts of the historic record and ignoring other parts of it. This manipulation of our ethnic identity is deeply disrespectful to our ancestors and our community, and it violates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This series of videos was created to show you that their claims are not supported by the historic record. The story that MNO tells has three main components. It begins with a claim that the 1871 Canadian Census shows that there are three groups of people living in Killarney: the old Killarney Metis families, a group of new settlers, and a group of Indians under Chief Onawegos. Part two of the story is that by 1891, those new settlers outnumber the native people in Killarney. This strained fishing resources for the old Killarney Métis and led to new fishing regulations. Beginning in 1893, a Killarney Métis man was being harassed by the settlers because he would not stop reporting them for fishing law violations. The old Killarney Métis families banded together to support the man and his family. So we're going to look first at the part of the story MNO tells about the 1871 census and three groups of people living in Killarney. But in order to understand it, we need to go back to the 1861 census. That census included not only Killarney, but Collins Inlet, Point Grondine, Whitefish Lake, Shebahonaning, Wikwemekong, Webjewong, etc., etc., etc. Lots of communities, some on the mainland and some on Manitoulin Island. All of the communities listed in the 1861 census for Killarney are settlements of First Nations people, except for Collins Inlet Village, which was made up of loggers working at the sawmill on the Mazenazing River, and that river connects to Collins Inlet. This is a cropped image of the census sheet. and it describes the area that was included in the 1861 census. It says Manitoulin Island, Lonely Island, mainland from northwest side of French River, taking La Cloche, to east side of Spanish River, north shore, Lake Huron. The yellow rectangles that are on this map represent the census area that I just described. I put them on this map, so they're just approximations. But the biggest yellow rectangle is Manitoulin Island, and the little rectangle, the little square beside it is Lonely Island, and then the smaller rectangle above shows the part of the North Shore that was included. So everything in yellow was included on the census. The red dot is where Shebahonaning is located. So you can see it was at an extremely large area that was on the census, and the enumerator for that census was George Ironside, who was the Indian agent. The 1871 census had a different census area. It no longer included Manitoulin Island and that giant section on the North Shore. What we see in the 1871 census is that little square that includes Lonely Island, and then 3 communities, Shebahonaning at the red dot, Collins Inlet, which is the blue dot, and the green dot represents the Point Grundine Indian Reserve. There were 2 or 3 communities on the census sheet with Killarney on every census until 1901. That was the first census that Killarney was on by itself. So let's take another look again at the first part of MNO's story, the 1871 census and the 3 groups of residents in Killarney. We know that, in fact, on that census sheet, there are 3 different communities shown: Killarney, Collins Inlet, and Point Grundine Reserve. We know that Collins Inlet Village existed by that time because of an 1860 report to the Commissioner of Crown Lands. In that report, they talk about the sawmill operation having moved from the Beaverstone River to the west bank of the Mazenazing, and they also talk about the houses along both sides of that river. In 1868, a new lumber mill was erected, also on the Mazenazing River, and in 1869, the Collins Inlet Post Office was opened. As far as where people of the Point Grundine Reserve were living, in 1873, we know from the Indian agent that they were living on the northern boundary of their reserve before 1873, and that in that year they were moving to the lake shore because they wanted to be closer to the fishing. So we're back again to the 3 parts of MNO's story, and we know that the first part about the 1871 census is not true. By 1891, the settlers outnumbered the native population. Well, that's not true either. This strained fishing resources for the old Killarney Metis and led to new fishing regulations. Well, there was a strain on fishing resources, and there were new fishing regulations that came into place. But the problems with the fisheries and the game in Ontario were not limited just to what was happening in Killarney. And I guarantee you that the provincial and federal governments would not have been looking at resources and regulations just because fishing resources were strained for Native people in Killarney. In 1893, a Killarney Metis man was harassed by the settlers because he rigorously reported them for fishing law violations. The old Killarney Metis families banded together to support the man and his family. This is the part of the story that everything else is building up to. Métis families fighting together against harassment by the white settlers. So we're going to take a look at MNO's story and see if it lines up with the events in the historic record. In an 1853 report to the Legislative Assembly, Shebahonaning was listed as one of the most valuable fisheries on Georgian Bay. Almost 30 years later, in 1881, the Member of Parliament for our area spoke in the House of Commons about a big change in the commercial fishing industry. He said fish have been exported, packed in ice, and the result has been to give a great deal of employment to poor local inhabitants, especially to half-Indians. The result is observable at one place especially, Killarney, which was formerly known as the most desolate and poorest place on the whole of the Great Lakes. The establishment of this industry there has been that Killarney has grown and flourished. Schools and churches have been erected, and instead of its being a mud hole, it is now a village with plank sidewalks and improvements. Well, we had only one school and one church, but Mr. Dawson was right about the importance of commercial fishing in our economy. The list on the left side of the screen is from the Canadian Census of Killarney. It shows that in 1891, members of many of our families were working as commercial fishermen. For those who may be wondering, Albert and Charles Lowe are also listed as commercial fishermen in the 1891 census, but they were not living here at that time. They were residents of Shebahonaning on Manitoulin Island. Most Killarney families had one or two people who fished for a living. There were 5 fishermen in the Proof families and 7 among the Rocks. Joe Rock became one of the most successful. He began working as a commercial fisherman in 1879, and by the 1890s he had his own fishing sailboat with a 24-foot keel and 2 men working with him. In 1893, Joe estimated that he took in about 10 tons of fish annually. He sold some of his catch to the C&J Noble Company and some to T.H. Jackman. They both were fish dealers and also operated general stores here. For those who are wondering, Clarence Noble was born at Collins Inlet in 1903 and is the ancestor of the Killarney Nobles. If there is a relationship between Clarence and the family of Charles and James Noble, it must be a very distant one. I haven't been able to find a connection through birth, marriage, and death certificates. Brothers Charles and James, under the company name C&J Noble, were fish dealers and commercial fishermen. They moved from Collingwood to Killarney around 1880, and by the 1890s they had 4 fishing tugs, along with other boats, nets and gear, and fishing stations. The Anne Long, one of their tugs, was the first vessel to be used in the Georgian Bay and Great Lakes Survey in 1883. The Nobles had established a very large, lucrative operation. They sold to many men of the surrounding area small fishing boats powered by sails, fishing nets, and any other gear and provisions that they might need. The nobles also purchased from them whatever fish they could catch. For years, there had been talk about game and fish stocks declining all over the province. In the commercial fishing industry, people argued about a lot of things, such as whether gill nets were more destructive than pond nets, when and where there should be closed seasons, the size of the mesh in nets, the idea of having fish hatcheries, encroachments on Canadian fisheries by Americans, encroachments on First Nations fisheries by non-natives. Everything relating to fishing was under discussion, including whether it should be the provincial or the federal government who created and enforced the regulations. In 1892, Ontario's Fish and Game Commission published its first report on the state of fish and game in the province. In 1893, the Dominion Fishery Commission investigated the fisheries in Ontario. James Noble testified that in the last few years, his company had doubled its annual sales to between 600 and 700 tons by increasing the number of boats and fishermen who supplied them. He said, "We do not expect a continuance of this business, as there is now a considerable decrease in the fisheries. We all know that well. If this excessive fishing goes on at the same rate, the fishing industries in the Georgian Bay and North Channel cannot last long." Some fisheries regulations were in place, but often they were not enforced. There were growing concerns from many people that the Great Lakes fisheries were being destroyed. Trying to get control of the situation, the Federal Department of Marine and Fisheries instructed their lighthouse keepers to start reporting fishing violations and to assist the local fisheries overseer. This survey map of Killarney was done in 1868, and it shows the lighthouses at each end of the Killarney Channel. I added the red dots so that the locations could be easily seen. The red dot on the left is the West Lighthouse, and you had to go by water to reach it. But the red dot on the right is the East Lighthouse, and you can see that there is a trail marked. It says Trail from Killarney to Indian Village, which refers to Chickasing, a topic for another video. And there's a trail that branches off from that just under the word Killarney, and it goes down to the East Lighthouse. I don't know if that trail still existed in 1893. Perhaps by that time you had to take a boat to get to the East Lighthouse as well. The lighthouse keeper at this time was Pierre Regis de la Morandière. He was known mostly by his initials, PR. That's him on the left with his wife, Virginie. And the other picture shows them standing outside their home on the farm. There's a small child with them and some of their sheep. The picture on the left shows the West Lighthouse. It was built in 1867, and it was the first new lighthouse in Canada to be lit after Confederation. The lighthouse at the east end looked exactly the same and was built the same year and it went into service a few days later. Both of them were still in place in the 1890s when the fishing controversy occurred here. In 1894, PR wrote a letter to the Member of Parliament for Port Arthur, and he said, "Dear Sir, last winter I received instructions from the Department of Marine to give all possible assistance to Mr. Elliott, F.O., meaning Fisheries Officer, Sault Ste. Marie, to enforce the fishery laws, and I think I did my duty, though an unpleasant one, faithfully, which I think Mr. Elliott can testify. And because I did so, all the fishermen of this place are against me, and I have been subjected to a terrible lot of trouble, and to me, considerable loss during the past season." Then he goes on to list his damages and to ask the MP if he will support him in an application to the minister for compensation. Next time, we'll take a look at the events that led to the losses that PR believes he should be compensated for. Join me next time for part 2 of the Métis Nation of Ontario's Great Racial Conflict in Killarney.